Hello, I'm Mark Martinez. This is Student-Led World History, and today we're going to talk about the greatest nation in the history of the world, Turkmenistan. Just kidding, I don't know what that is, but today we are going to talk about political revolutions from the 18th and 19th centuries, so strap yourself in for another exciting episode. Yeehaw. Let's talk about America. Bouncing over to the soon-to-be land of the free, we have some pretty weird government stuff going on. The colonies were technically ruled by the sovereign of Britain, but all the people that made the decisions were wealthy landowners and governors. All wasps, to be sure. But how did the 13 colonies become America? Well, it all started with the 7 Years' War, which we talked a little bit about last episode. Basically, Britain fought France for control of North America. Britain won, and attached its new territory to the 13 colonies in Canada. However, the war was, as most are, expensive, and Britain started taxing the 13 colonies more to recuperate its losses. This was seen as an intolerable act, and many wealthy landowners spearheaded a movement to give the colonies more say in British politics. The war was a bloody affair, and it pitted? It pat the Loyalists or Tories who wanted to remain a subject of Great Britain against the Patriots who fought against the Crown. So how did a call for taxation with representation evolve into a call for liberty? Well, the answer lies with the Sons of Liberty, a radical faction made up of colonial high society who wanted to push the revolution a bit further. Many of the Sons of Liberty would later make up the Founding Fathers. One of the most outspoken of the Founding Fathers was Thomas Paine, who wrote Common Sense, a propaganda manuscript that called for secession from Britain. And another Founding Father that you might have heard of is Benjamin Franklin. During the Revolution, Ben established solid relationships with France, which helped bring European support into the war. And another little-known Founding Father you probably should have heard of is George Washington, whose military escapades demoralized the British and led to the Declaration of Independence being ratified. And lastly, there's Tommy. Thomas Jefferson, of course, was a lawyer who preached for greater popular participation in government and advocated for the rights of man. All of these men have been mythologized in history books and have their fair share of legends surrounding them. Still, they help us understand that the American Revolution happened because of, tension between the colonial elite and the British Crown. It comes as no surprise that the new government established in America only let the landowning men vote, and continued mass slavery in the country. Remember that 7 Years' War thing? Well, as you may recall, France lost and England won. But England went broke, which means that France went mega broke. And even as the price of bread continued to rise, Louis the XVI continued to have extravagant parties. The man even sent support to the revolutionaries in America, further bankrupting the country. Louis, in an attempt to fix his deteriorating country, called the Estates General, a political entity comprising of 3 classes of French society: the nobility, the clergy, and the peasantry. Each estate got 1 vote, so the peasants voted for things like less taxes during a famine, and the other 2 said no. This angered the people, so they stormed out and held their own government at a tennis court. They vowed in what would be known as the tennis court oath, to never disband as long as France remained without a constitution. After making all that racket, the peasants took over Paris, and at first Louis cooperated with them, but this quickly changed after he was caught trying to escape France, and he was swiftly guillotined. And so began the Reign of Terror. The Reign of Terror revolved around the Jacobins and their glorious leader, Maximilien Robespierre. The Jacobins are radicals who instituted a brutal police state in France. Thousands were executed for petty crimes, all the while France was fighting against the rest of Europe in coalition wars. Ultimately, Robespierre was ousted, guillotined, and moderates took over the government. The moderates were feeling pressure from those coalition wars and gave a certain general the chance to overthrow the government. This general, Napoleon Bonaparte, managed to beat back the coalition, and as his success grew, so too did his ego. He called himself consul, then emperor. Styling himself after Julius Caesar, he then established the French Empire. Bonaparte aimed to destroy Britain, his greatest rival, through a pan-European blockade. However, Spain, one of France's allies, had enough of his shenanigans and revolted. Bonaparte crushed this resistance brutally, and his campaigns in Spain would have a global impact. And on a slightly less global scale, Russia broke the blockade on Britain for some sweet, sweet cash. Bonaparte, in a blind rage, forgot one of history's greatest rules: never invade Russia during the winter, unless, of course, you're the And so Napoleon was defeated, and the Congress of Vienna was called to pick up the pieces. Now, France had some other colonies aside from the ones they lost in the 7 Years' War. A trend that you might have picked up on by now is that as colonial overlords lost authority, their colonies became increasingly restless. France was no different. As it underwent political turmoil during the Revolution, Haiti, its most profitable colony, revolted. To understand why the Haitians revolted, we need to understand the political, social, and economic structures of the island. Haiti exported sugar, tobacco, and coffee, all high-demand cash crops needing hard labor. This labor is done by slaves brought from Africa, and as the demand rose, the amount of slaves imported increased as well. Naturally, the vast majority of the colony's population were slaves. However, some wealthy Frenchmen immigrated to the island as well. These petite bourgeoisie, or Grand Blancs as they were called, administered the colony and established a caste system in the mid-18th century. The caste system had 3 tiers. On top were the Grand Blancs, the owner of the plantations. In the middle were the Petite Blancs, who were poor whites who didn't own any land. And the final caste were the slaves, who were treated with excess cruelty and violence. And things looked on the up and up when France declared the rights of man. They seemed to be moving to curb slavery in their colonies. However, the colony ultimately changed little, and the Haitians were fed up. And so, revolt. The revolutionaries, who were a coalition made up of the slaves and the Petite Blancs, greatly outnumbered the loyalists on the island. France could expend few troops for the revolt, and ultimately the Haitians were victorious. One of the leading figures was Toussaint Louverture, an Enlightenment thinker and prominent general in the Haitian army. He sought to address one of the Enlightenment's biggest contradictions, the existence of slavery, by abolishing it. Ultimately, he was betrayed by one of his generals, but many of his ideas were codified into the national identity of Haiti. Speaking of North America, let's talk about Mexico. During the 19th century, Mexico was Spain's largest colony, stretching from southern California to Panama. Much like Haiti, there was a caste system in the colony, meaning that the colony's leaders weren't exactly popular. What separated Mexico's caste system from Haiti's was the distinction between wealthy white people who immigrated to the Americas, called peninsulares, and the ones born in the Americas, called criollos. This created tension, even among the upper classes. And this, coupled with the horrendous treatment of Native Americans and African slaves, led to colonial Mexico being extremely unstable. This instability was further exacerbated by the Napoleonic Wars, where Spain was occupied by France. The revolution started with Miguel Hidalgo's Cry of Dolores, where he proclaimed that Mexico should become independent and establish racial equality. Hidalgo was eventually captured and killed, but his ideas were popular, and many new factions emerged and continued on. José María Morelos assumed leadership of the independence movement and occupied most of the colony. Morelos established a Congress and drafted the Mexican Constitution. Despite his success, he was defeated by the Royalist Party, a conservative faction who wanted independence, but didn't want any change in the social structure. The Royalists were led by Agustín de Iturbide, and they successfully negotiated for their independence from Spain. Iturbide was eventually declared Emperor of Mexico, but this was short-lived, as a year later he was ousted and the Republic of Mexico was formed. The revolutions in Mexico and Haiti were congruent to similar revolutions across Latin America. In Brazil, Pedro I declared independence from his father, and the political and social structure of Brazil stayed intact. In Venezuela, Simón Bolívar managed to persuade local armies to join the revolution against Spain, and they managed to seize several key cities and kick out the Spanish. In Argentina, José de San Martín fought against the Royalists and became known as the liberator of Argentina, Chile, and Peru. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go over all of these, but there are quite a few trends that can be seen across the political revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries. The question of what form the government should take, what rights should be given to who should be allowed to participate, and how Enlightenment thought should be applied were all posed to new nations formed by political revolutions in the 18th and 19th centuries. Remember, the word revolution comes from going in a circle. Many revolutions ended up exactly where they are, and many of those questions are still unanswered to this day. But that's everything you need to know about the political revolutions in the 18th and 19th centuries. Join us next episode where we finally talk about Russia, Japan, and go over everything from 1800 to 1914. But until then, please subscribe, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.